The first thing we should do when we notice a messy situation like this at the edge of our project is to catch the runaway stitch and secure it. It should be somewhere at the very bottom of the messy segment of the edge, and mine is right over here. So hold that stitch, take a safety pin, a locking stitch marker, pretty much anything, and insert it into that stitch to make sure it doesn't go any further. Then let's sort the mess. It looks scary, but when you take it like this and pull it sideways to the right, you will see that all this mess is just a series of loops. So here I have just 2 loops, and each loop represents 2 stitches, 1 stitch from one row and then 1 stitch from the row above it. And we know that garter stitch, when we look at one side of the garter stitch, it is formed by knit stitches in one row and purl stitches in the other row. And that means that we're gonna fix these loops by knitting and purling a stitch. If the garter stitch is made by knitting stitches in every row, then the stitch that you've just caught, considering that all loops are of the same size, then this stitch is a knit stitch, and that means we start fixing the first loop by purling a stitch. And here's how we do it. So undo this safety pin and make sure that stitch is safe and doesn't go any further. So keep an eye on that little guy. And then insert the tip of the left needle from front to back into a loop that is the closest to the runaway stitch. See, I don't want to let it go. So into this loop, I go front to back, and then you go from back to front into the stitch itself, like this. Then take a spare needle in your right hand and use the tip of this right needle to bring the strand to the front of the stitch. If the yarn is thick, you can do it with your fingers. That's totally fine. And then insert the tip of the right needle from right to left into the stitch and pass it over the yarn strand and off the needle, like this. So we just pull the stitch. Now insert the tip of the right needle from right to left into that stitch and take the left needle out, basically slipping the stitch to the right needle. So I'm going to hide the other loop so it's not in the way, and we'll see that we still have half of the loop because we've just made 1 stitch. We still have half of the loop loose over here. So we're going to use this strand to knit a stitch, because remember, we alternate, we purl and then knit. So with the stitch still on the right needle, we go under the other half of the same yarn strand, of the same yarn loop, and then insert the tip of the left needle from left to right into the stitch and pass it over and off the needle. So that's it. We've just fixed 1 loop, and as you see, the edge looks as if nothing has ever happened to it. And then simply repeat these steps. So I bring back this loop and then we'll do it again. So first we make a purl stitch. We go front to back into the loop and then back to front into the stitch. Bring the loop to the front of the stitch, then with the right needle go into the stitch and pass it over the yarn loop, and then slip it basically back to the right needle purlwise. Then we insert the right needle under the other half of the loop, and with the left needle we go into the stitch and knit this other half of the loop through the stitch, making a knit stitch, and then bring the stitch to the needle and resume your work. And you see that the edge is fixed and it looks exactly like this edge. Maybe a little bit looser, but it's easy to fix with blocking. Now let's see how we can fix the edge of a garter stitch that is made by purling stitches in every row. In this type of garter stitch, the runaway stitch, the one that we see at the very bottom of the messy part, is a purl, given that all loops are of the same size. So this is a purl stitch, and that means that we will still make 2 stitches out of each loop. We'll make a knit and a purl, but we'll start with a knit stitch, not a purl stitch as we did in the previous example when the garter stitch was made by knitting all stitches in every row. So here's how we do it. Insert the tip of the right needle from front to back into the open stitch, and then from back to front into the loop that is the closest to the open stitch. So I'm going to hide the other loop so it's not in the way, and you can clearly see what's going on the needles. Then insert the left needle from left to right into the stitch and pass the stitch over the strand and off the right needle. So we've just knit a stitch. Now insert the tip of the left needle from back to front under the other half of the strand and from left to right into the stitch that is on the right needle, slipping it to the left needle. Now with the tip of the right needle or with your hands, just bring the strand to the front of the stitch. If the yarn is thick, like I said, you can use your fingers. And then go into the stitch and pass it over the strand, making a purl. That's it. That's how simple it is. Let's do it again. So we have one more loop. So I insert the tip of the right needle front to back into the stitch and back to front into the loop that is the closest of to the stitch, and this is the only loop that we have left. And then with the left needle we pass the stitch over the loop. Then the left needle goes under the strand from back to front under the other half of the loop and into the stitch. Then we bring the strand to the front, go into the stitch and finish fixing this loop by purling the stitch. And as you see, the edge looks as if nothing has ever happened to it. The full tutorial about this technique is at tenrosday.com/fix-garter-edge. Happy knitting, my friend. I'll talk to you in the next tutorial.